All right. Thank you, Ellie. All right. So thanks everybody for coming to our Conversation Cafe. Our guest today is Syed Adnan Hussain. We're going to go by Adnan. He is a professor, an old professor of mine from St. Mary's University in Halifax. He studies a lot of different things in the realm of religion, women and gender studies, and Islam. He's just got a lot of knowledge about everything. So I reached out to him to speak to us and knew that whatever sort of angle he was going to come from was going to be an interesting conversation. And so we started talking about Sufi poetry and specifically about the concepts of love and dignity during this really crazy year and what he refers to as turbulent times. And so today Adnan's going to speak a bit about what got him into that, his exploration, and then we're going to go through a few poems together and kind of dissect them and see what we can kind of learn from this beautiful poetic tradition. So thank you, Adnan, and I'll let you kind of go from there.
Wonderful. And Ashley, if you don't mind, could I have control so I could share
Yes.
a couple of slides?
Ellie, I don't appear to have co-host capabilities, so could you allow him to share his screen or make us both co-hosts? Thanks.
Thank you.
The joys of Zoom.
I think you've accidentally put me as co-host.
I think so.
Adnan, you should be able to share now.
Wonderful. Yes, I can. Great. I hope you'll be able to see this. Just some slides there. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Wonderful. And my apologies if you hear something that sounds like a war going on in the background. That is my sons. They are my fault, and that sound is my fault also. I made swords for them, and they hit each other with them often. It's indoor times, right? Make them foam swords, and they'll beat each other up. Okay, wonderful. With just to as a way of starting this talk, I just wanted to acknowledge that I am on the lands, historically the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq, and the reason why that's important, and it'll provide a neat way for us to cross into the discussion of today as well, is what's going on. You may have heard in the news with the torching of some fisheries here in Nova Scotia, and a little bit about what we're talking about. What I'd like to talk about today is how we see our relationships to each other, and also perhaps our relationships to the world around us. And one of the threats of the present is this desire to atomize us as purchasers, as people who interact with the world in terms of transactional relationships, as opposed to people who have meaningful and deep connections with each other. And one of the reasons that happens is because everything around us is set up to treat us in that transactional manner. In fact, if you just looked at the language on airline magazines. In the 2000s, we were passengers. In the 2020s, you are customers. The customer needs to have a certain experience of flying, as opposed to the passenger needs to experience a journey. Right, the shift in these modalities means that increasingly we are being thought of and imagined as mere consumers. So what's happening in the case of Nova Scotia is that there has been a conflict created by the fact that there is a restriction on fishing at certain times for non-Indigenous fishermen. And Indigenous fishermen don't have the same restrictions on them because of their treaty rights. So this conflict has occurred because for poor white people in Nova Scotia, that looks an awful lot like a special benefit, like a minimum wage that's guaranteed to indigenous people, which they don't get to participate in. And for the indigenous people, these are rights that are guaranteed. And if the boot of kind of colonial occupation is squeezing your neck so tight, they're lifting it just enough for you to fish to survive, right? And so the issue in the case in Nova Scotia, we see it from a neoliberal perspective, from a positive law perspective, as a conflict over rights and who should we divide and give the goodies to, who is specially classified to receive these goodies. But if we shift our thinking, so I would propose if we shift our thinking to the kind of the world that Martin Luther King is trying to imagine, the kind of beloved society that he's trying to imagine, a society reoriented towards love, where citizenship is based more on the idea of each other's dignity and a love and a respect for each other, fundamentally would say that those poor white fishermen who are also disadvantaged should be receiving some sort of basic income. Because if we have told them that they are not allowed to exploit a resource, then ultimately, if you haven't given them something in return, but only merely given them a restriction, you force them to direct their anger against people that it is not rightly directed at, the indigenous people here, as opposed to the government who made the regulations and then didn't accommodate the people that would be disenfranchised. And so that is kind of a way of us starting in to think about what does it mean if you have a society that's built on a shifting premise of love for the other, as opposed to us all pessimistically taking what we can when we can to try and satisfy ourselves because we don't know what's over the horizon and what to anticipate what comes next. And so the way that we are dealing with the world now, especially our tendency to reframe it to ourselves in terms of apocalypse, in terms of the end, in terms of a terrific fear that's being raised, especially by the U.S. Election, if nothing else, then the question must be we have to ask is what would reorienting this world look like? What would reimagining this world look like? And these same questions have been considered at various times by scholars and thinkers in different traditions. For example, in China, Xunzi would be arguing not directly, but in philosophy with Mencius, Mengzi, and Mengzi's belief was that the inherent nature of people is good, and so we should build our society on that premise. And Xunzi's inherent belief was the inherent nature of man is evil. And so we have to build systems to control this beast, right? And so those philosophies inform the ways that our laws are structured, the kinds of ways that we are atomized. And so these poems are a little bit of an imagination of what a world looks like beyond that atomization, beyond that idea of the transactional relationships. So this first one is by Fariduddin Attar, and this is kind of where I would be happy for us to open this up a bit too. And I'd like to think of myself as a conversation partner as opposed to someone just delivering. This poem by Attar is called Losing Two. And he says here, I know without knowing that I don't know if you are I or I you. I've lost two things, myself in you and duality. So I was wondering, what do you think of that poem? What is our poet on about? And then I'll give you a little bit more to round out the discussion.
Seems like yeah. Oh, sorry. By considering connection, you lose the boundary between yourself and what you're considering.
Mm-hmm. We have Mark next. Mark, would you like to offer us something?
Sorry about that. Yeah, it seems difference has been erased. That was all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else?
I would say that it's really countercultural to the North American culture where everything is about me and where I have very clear boundaries around me. and this melts me into you, into us.
Mhm. Mhm. Maggie, did you want to give us something?
Yeah, it's you are lost in the other, but it's not really lost in the other. You are found in the other, and there is no you and I, so there's no duality. As everyone has said, you know, the we it becomes, all of us becomes a we, or all of us become an I.
Hmm. Hmm. You know, it might also be a little play on the idea is it comes a little bit out of kind of Neoplatonic philosophy, and it's the idea that all of creation is connected, and it is all connected to this primordial source, and that the divisions between us are the illusion. Buddha may have referred to it as Maya. It may have been referred to other philosophies. The idea that the world is an illusion and that the only reality is the real behind the real, right? The really real. And the really real is in the connection. Take, for example, the way we are looking at the world today. Let me just make this point kind of obvious that we know that the nation state system, the atomized system where we are all divided up, ultimately is a loser's gambit when it comes to the environment and the future of this planet. That we have to be moving increasingly towards a unified world, kind of in terms of our organization, our governance, and also to correct historical wrongs that have been done to certain populations and certain communities, because these are world problems, right? The Netherlands just made a decision to repay, for example, Indonesia for the millions that died because of colonialism, but that kind of atomized response is part of the problem, that it needs to be seen as a world issue. And so we know that the future has to be that connection. But when we think about it actively politically, denying the power of the nation state, denying the parochialism of our particular province seems like madness, right? Like we need those boundaries. Otherwise, how do we keep other people out? Who will come in and take our goodies? Will our language be able to be preserved? Will our culture survive that connection? But really, when we all know that the future is movement together, and we know that if we ever leave this planet, right, like when we're talking about the funk of the 1970s, when they're talking about the Starship Earth, they're talking about that unity because they're imagining a future in which we have left this parochialism behind. Much of the parochialism and the kind of infighting that you're seeing in the world today is a direct result of colonialism. And so how will the nationalist, colonialist, capitalist system undo the world that it has created? It simply can't, right? It's impossible. And so Attar here is imagining a little bit of that, but also for the mystics, it is the dream, for example, of them is the mystic can explain to you the pain that a drop would feel to be separated from the ocean. And in the same way, the elation that the drop would feel to return and be obliterated in that ocean, right? That is what the mystic is trying to illustrate to you, that your finiteness can only ever be resolved through dissolving into the infinite, right? And so that's what Attar here is trying to draw our attention to. That if I, and the you here, often in Sufi poetry especially, the informal, personal you is often a reference to God. Muhammad in poetry will often be referenced in the formal sense with the thee form or the thou form of in English, whereas God will have the familiar you form because in the Quranic understanding, God is closer to you than your jugular vein. It's the idea that God is already there, right? You don't have to go anywhere to seek him, to seek God. All right, let's go on to the next one. This is Ahmad Ghazali, also a famous Sufi master, and he writes here, I will write you a book on radical love, provided that you do not bifurcate it into divine love and human love. What about that one? What do you think our poets are trying to tell us here?
I think the idea is that radical love does encompass divine love and human love together.
I think it reminds me of whether you're talking about the Jewish Bible or one of the other like Abrahamic faiths, like when people talk about Song of Songs and some of these other um, books, they always are trying to figure out whether the people were writing about other humans or about God or about both. And so this is really reminding me of that and sort of this sense of like maybe the answer is both and, where people are always trying to divide those two or argue, you know.
What about they are the same?
Yeah. Yeah. Beyond the both and
Yeah,
just
all love is God's love.
Mm.
We participate in God's love by loving others.
I think that is although I suspect that the poem carries in it the multiple meanings that we bring up, but the one that Maggie raised is probably the direction Ahmad Ghazali was thinking himself, because one of the complaints that the Sufis have is that Sufism goes through many forms and it exists in many forms. Increasingly in the present period, we refer to it as the mystical tradition or the mystical dimension of Islam, but that is something that is genitive of, again, colonialism's impact on defining it separately as a form of mystical practice. In general, it was not unusual for someone who was a scholar of law to also be a Sufi master. Someone would belong to a Sufi tariqa as well as teach at the mosque Quran recitation. It's not unusual for those identities to have existed simultaneously. It's just that if you seek the path of love, the path to of the divine through love, then these traditions would have excited you more, and you would have gone and hung out at their lodges. You would have listened to their poetry. You would have participated in their dances. But if it didn't appeal to you, you wouldn't. But given the way that we look at the past in our relationship to the way that it operates, increasingly Islam is thought of as formalisms. The length of your beard, how high your pant is above your ankle, whether or not you went to Mecca, whether or not you did the five prayers, whether or not you paid the zakat. These kinds of issues are the legalistic approach to Islam. That is the way an anthropologist could study a community, checking off checkboxes. You know, did they? But the bit that it misses in that image, of course, is the internal. These are all external. These are all external verifiable factors, right? These are the kinds of things you can fake, right? But ultimately, for the Sufis, their question is, what about the inside? This is why Bulle Shah, the poet will ask, par hazaron kitabon. You know, you've read 1,000 books, but have you looked inside? Have you read what lies inside your heart? And then the Sufis say that the seeking of experience of God is maybe what the greatest part of the mystic journey is. So how can you begin to experience God? Where do I search for that? Where can I seek mystic experience? And the Sufis will say, in the mundane, in the love that you have for your children, in the love for your cat, in the love for your family. That love is love. And that love should not be separated necessarily from the love of the divine. The ecstasy that you feel in that love is not necessarily a bad thing. Moreover, that's why they flirt with the idea of ecstasy with drugs and alcohol as well, because that's not necessarily different than the kind of ecstasy you might feel in the presence of God. Don't necessarily separate it. But there is danger because you could just end up a drunk or you could just end up a drug addict. So you may seek what it tastes like to sip from the cup of the divine by sipping wine, but if you drink too deeply, you're just drunk, right?
Mm.
And the goal is to cross over, to have that love be the love that you live with constantly. The love that you feel for others in the world can become even the radical other, the unknown other, the other you don't recognize. And so that's a little bit of what he's playing with here. Ellie, you seem like you have something for us.
Yeah, I find this fascinating because you speak of Islam and I could speak of my tradition, which is Christianity, in just the same way. And I'm wondering if it's just, it's much harder to find that, what I would call the middle way, because it's always easier, it seems to be extreme. Don't do this, don't do that, do this, wear this, don't do this. In Christianity, a lot of those don'ts have to do with sexuality. Um, and it's much harder to find that path to drink enough to be filled but not to be drunk. That's a beautiful image. And so I think that's the art of living in a way for all people, and whether it's a religion or a philosophy. But I think that's a real challenge. Just like, I guess my question is, I love the poetry. How do we live that? What does that look like in everyday life?
Right. Well, in the practical sense is that that small reorientation that I was discussing earlier, right? In terms of that, if let me give you an example. One of the problems is that in the way that we divide time up now. So we structure time in terms of almost a positive ethic of time, that our time is divided into 24 hours. These are how many hours I'm allowed to sleep. These are how many hours I'm required to work. This is the amount of labor that is owed to my masters to allow me to have a certain amount of freedom and to earn a certain amount of money. And fundamentally, all of that, we start to associate ourselves with that is what we are. So when you're at a cocktail party, what do you do? As in, are you merely that thing which you do, right? And for the Sufi, that question may be a bit wrong, right? Because, or alternatively, if a Sufi political ethic was to come in, the idea that free time, for example, the something which the Greeks thought was extremely important to be able to have a democratic system, the idea that you have leisure time is something which is essential to cultivating an ethic, for cultivating ethics at all, right? You have to be able to sit back and reflect. And if all your time is colonized and it's all snatched away from you, when are you meant to sit and read this poem? When are you meant to sit and reflect on this and think about the oneness and to think about the possibility of getting beyond the tit for tat exchanges that we often end up in, right? And so, as a practical ethic, Sufism would have to first begin with a commitment to being less worldly, having less of your time colonized by the world, and having more of the time available to you to engage in these ethical reflections, ethical exercises. I believe that the way the world is structured today is designed to have us at each other's throats. And unless you have the time to sit back, take a breath, right? The breath, the thing which was snatched from George Floyd, right? Like the thing which he needed was someone to get the boot off his neck so he could take a breath to see and live. And I feel that that is something that the Sufis are always hearkening to as an ethic. Sufism and the ethic of love in the world today would mean things like a basic income, would mean things like healthcare for all, would mean things like free education, things which allow you to have that ethical space for reflection, allow you to be in the world and have the time for a moment and to engage in the kinds of these kind of radical acts of imagining and loving. Great. Well, let me hop us on to the next one. So this is by Mirza Ghalib. He is an important poet in the North Indian Urdu Islamicate traditions. And he writes this very interesting poem. And a little bit of a background. There's this famous Hadith Qudsi, which is thought to be the kind of highest level of narration by Muhammad. And he makes the comment once about this something called the Hadith of the hidden treasure. And it describes God as, it says, I was a hidden treasure that longed to be found. And so I made creation. So it's the idea that God's desire, if we, to the extent that we can understand or know God's desire, is fashioned in a desire to be discovered. The divine wishes to be known, and that's how the Islam narrates it's the arrival of prophets. Each one of them is a messenger to try and bridge that divide between creator and creation. So each of these prophets is attempting to do this. And in his very cheeky fashion, at the point of millenarian expectation for the Shias, they thought the end of the world might be coming in the 1850s. This is the same time that the Baha'i movement comes out of the same millenarian expectation in the 1850s, the same time the Ahmadi movement is going to come out. And Mirza Ghalib is watching the British formally shift their rule into company rule into the British Empire right after the uprising. So Mirza Ghalib is seeing all this happen, and he says, when there was nothing, then God was. If nothing was, then God would be. Being myself drowned, if I were not, what would there be? And he's using the word khuda na hota to kya hota. So he's saying, if there was not God, what would there be? Is the question that he's asking. And then he's very cheekily at the end saying, what if there was no me? If I did not exist to even ask these questions, what would any of this matter? And that is a very cheeky hint at the relationship between the infinite and between us, that it doesn't matter unless we matter too. And I was wondering if anyone else had comment on it.
I think it brings back the story of the drop of the ocean, and I see it as, if there was not a drop of the ocean, there would not be an ocean.
Mm.
So that if I were not, there wouldn't be either, because if we're all part of the divine, if you remove those that make the divine, which is the created order, there wouldn't be a divine. But it's again the issue of the water with the ocean, but also well, let me shut up.
No, I think you were really on. I think you were onto it. That last line here that says "Na hota main to kya hota." If there were not I, what would there be? I think in this is kind of in Ghalib's way, is how he's processing this despair that he's seeing in the world around him. And he's maybe even commenting a little bit about what it means to be a witness to the despair of others. Is that being there, being at all, in the same way the Occupy movement, which made it about being in a space and using your body to occupy a space. Being itself is sacred, right? This is Joshua Herschel's idea as well, is that to be is sacred, to live is sacred in and of itself. Then let's hop to this last one. I'll read you the full poem, but I don't have it put up here because it turns the slide into just gobbledygook. So I will read you the whole poem, and then we can look at this particular line by Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Just give me one sec. So he writes here, देखेंगे, lazim hai ki hum bhi देखेंगे. We will see. It is certain that we too will see the day which is promised, that was written on the tablet of eternity, when mountains of oppression and cruelty will be blown away like cotton under the feet of the oppressed. The earth shall grumble and rumble, and above the heads of the powerful, lightning will crack and crackle. We shall see, when God's earth and home, all idols will be ripped from it. We, the people of purity who were previously dismissed as haram, will be seated on cushions. All crowns will topple, all thrones will be cast down. We will see that all that will remain will be the name of God, which is both invisible and present, which is both sight and the spectacle. And finally, the cry that An al Haq, I am the truth, will arise, which I am, and so are you. And the creation of God will rule, which I am, and so are you. We shall see, it is certain too that we shall see. Hum dekhenge, lazim hai ki hum bhi dekhenge. So that is the poem by Fez. And I love this poem so much that I named one of my sons after the poet. For me, Fez was a very important thinker. So when Pakistan was formed, there was uncertainty about what the future of the country would look like. Would it be an Islamic state? Would it recognize the fact that a majority of the population spoke Bengali and did not speak English or Urdu, which became the official languages of the country? What would be the system of government? How would the philosophy of a system of government operate? What does it mean to create an Islamic state? Those are the questions I sought to answer in my doctoral work. But here, I think what Fez is doing is he also believes in the ethics of socialism. And he was exiled from Pakistan as a communist and as a Marxist and lived for many years in Russia. And the Russians actually built an Urdu language institution around him and his poetry because of the significance of it. And the first significant translation was done by a Russian translator, Viktor Kiernan, of Faiz Ahmed Faiz's work. So for him, he sees the ethic of love in the ideals of socialism, perhaps not the realities that result in something like the pogroms in Russia or the state killings in China, but rather that the possibility exists that we create political orders which are built on something more, on something deeper on the connections between us. And in the poem, he's explicitly using Quranic imagery. The mountains toppling like cotton is an image from the later surahs of the Quran. If you're holding your Quran and you flip to the very end, the earliest surahs of the Quran are the very short ones at the end, 1 to 2 pages long. The Quran is usually organized by length, so longest to shortest. At the very end are these shorter surahs. They're highly poetic, they're rhyming. They're the desperation of a prophet attempting to reach his people and drag them out of ignorance, right? This is the period of those surahs. And all of them describe the images of the world being rent apart, terrible earthquakes, lightning cracking. And so Fez is very explicitly tying in to this apocalyptic imagery and then promising us that eventually we're going to realize that maybe there isn't anything more important than that one individual person and the rights and dignity of that one individual person. And that right and dignity is premised also on my right and dignity, my existence too. That ultimately it is in the same way that the philosopher Charles Taylor will talk about a politics of recognition, This is a kind of a politics of recognition. It's that I realize the divinity in you, that I realize that you are a mirror and reflecting God's majesty, in the same way that ultimately, if we pull all of the things out of the way that stop you from seeing that truth, your misery, your inability to pay your rent, your inability to feed yourself, we have to take that away, and then you will be able to see the truth. And until then, those barriers will get in your way. And that's what I see in this poem. And it moves me very deeply. And it's the promise that moves me. Hum dekhenge. It's lazim hai ki hum dekhenge. He is promising me that I'll see that day. And even though Faiz Ahmad Faiz did not live himself to see that day, he spent many years in prison because of our dictators, and then ultimately died, but died in his own country in '84. And he unfortunately died while we still were occupied by a dictator. But the dream that he did not see was the dream that I saw as a child when we cheered on the streets when the dictator's plane exploded. So that's what I had to say, and I'd be happy to open it up for a general discussion.
Thank you so much. There is so much to think about there, I find. Just a lot of food for thought. Anybody have anything specific on their minds in relation to everything?
May I just add, the whole thing of Ana al-Haq is actually from Halag. I mean, do you want to do something with that, Ya Adnan?
Sure. So the cry of An al-Haq in Sufism especially, and Halaj was introduced to the English and French speakers by the work of Louis Massignon. But he talks about the Halaj came to a realization that the only way that the world makes sense is if I am the truth, if An al-Haq. And he proclaimed this loudly and publicly. And it was for that and for some stuff he was doing with the pilgrimage, which we don't have to get into. But for that reason, he was accused of being a blasphemer for claiming that he was the truth instead of God is the truth. And ultimately, he was killed and he was cut into pieces in the public square. He was hung and then cut into pieces. And his followers claim that as each part of his body was cut off, it screamed out An al-Haq, and then it was destroyed. And so often Sufis will speak to the martyr Halaj, and especially the idea that he proclaims this and he's willing to go to his death. He doesn't resist it. He doesn't fight it. It's very Christ-like. It's sort of the idea that he accepts it because he no longer sees the reason. He no longer sees the barrier between the living and the dead. And sometimes Sufis will refer to themselves as those that have already died. That they have reached the point in their life where this worldliness ceases to have the relevance for them. And I hesitate when I reach that level of Sufism because I do think that the world is important. And the way that the ethic was translated into my life is my grandfather, when he taught me religion, he said, I'm going to teach you only one thing, and this is the only thing you have to remember and you have to put into your life, is that heaven and hell don't exist, but what you make of this world is going to be your heaven or hell. And that was what he would keep telling me. And it didn't make sense to an 8-year-old when he died, but I've carried it and I've thought on it.
I guess it's all of these are just so thought-provoking in the sense of really trying to see people beyond labels and identities. And I think what we see, especially in the media and in, as you mentioned at the beginning, even with what's happening in Nova Scotia, is there's us versus them. It's always group versus group, people versus people. And so I guess like a question that I have is like, how do we put this into our daily lives? Like, how do I take steps to, especially if I'm engaging with someone who has a different opinion or experience or background from me, like, how do I use this wisdom to see them and to remember that, you know, maybe they are a reflection of me or of the divine. And how does that transform my relationships with those people? I guess it's a big question, or two questions really.
Um, well, let me give you an example of maybe what goes on in my life in the microcosm, and maybe it'll help to hear how I deal with this. So I went to McGill for my undergrad, and when I graduated, a friend and I both went to law school, and we both graduated, and we were both kind of thinking about what to do after law school. And I went to get my doctorate, and he was working in Toronto, and then he had a terrible mental health breakdown, and he hasn't recovered yet, and this happened about 10 years ago, and he lives near Halifax. And so he comes to my house often, and he's a difficult person to deal with, because often he'll if there's money left lying out, he'll take it. If there's bus tickets and stuff, he'll take it. If there's any food anywhere in the house, he'll eat his way through all of it. And so and my feeling is that I love him very much as a person, and I can see him beyond his addictions, beyond his smallness, beyond his pettiness. And that commitment to him as a being allows me to get over some of the daily misery that he can put me through when he's here. But does that mean that I should be a doormat for him? Does that mean that I allow him to loot my home freely, and to inconvenience me and the family freely? And then, of course not. But I do tell him that I love you, and I love you, and you have a home here, and you have a place here. But some of the shit you do drives me crazy, and I need you to try and rein some of that in, and I'm still going to love you if you still screw up. But it's going to mean that I love with gritted teeth, which is also a form of love, right? Uh, and that because I'm committed to his betterment, I'm committed to his health, I'm committed to him thriving, staying alive in some cases, that he knows that in this space he is welcome. In this space he is always going to have a sense of home. So that is, like, in a practical way, have implemented this ethic. And it does mean that I can't see our relationship as merely transactional, because if all I look at it as what this is kind of the pop psychology approach. People will say, you got to cut out those people in your life that do nothing but take from you, that kind of nonsense that you always hear. But sometimes those people that take from me are the other side of me. He is the reflection of me. He is this less successful version of me who had mental health problems, and I didn't. And so seeing him as my mirror also makes me realize that I would also want to be cared for in his position. And that seeing myself in him, and the kind of dignity of him, is how I try to get out of the paralysis of wanting to just dismiss him, or chase him away from me, or not deal with him because he's inconvenient.
Thank you. I
Wow.
think Asfar, Ellie, you were going to read a question that Asfar had written in the comments.
Yes, Asfar wrote something. And I'm also wondering, Adnan, if it would be possible to take the shared screen off, or if you still would prefer to
Yeah,
have it there,
totally.
because then it might be nicer to see each other. So Asfar, who can't speak because he's in the library, says, amazing talk, thanks so much. As you mentioned, it's hard to get the real vision of life while we are colonized among worldly needs. Do you feel educational awareness, so encouraging people to live minimalistic life rather than just being consumers, can improve the situation a bit?
Mm. Well, thank you, Asfar. I don't know. I'd like to think that sometimes the life of simplicity, of owning few things, would be terribly freeing. But my family were kind of double refugees. They ended up from India in East Pakistan. Then when East Pakistan became Bangladesh, they ended up in Pakistan, and then most of us ended up here in the West. So I have all of these, like, stupid knickknacks from all over my life, which are so deeply connected to my memory.
Mhm.
And in Islam, there's a sense that people are not evil, but they're born forgetful. And in fact, the way that the Quran refers to the relationship between God and creation is the idea of remember me and I will remember you. And even practices of prayer are about memory. So for me, material objects can sometimes get infused with this memory, but it's not about its material worth. It's about the emotion that I have attached to it at that point. And so for me, sometimes even something stupid like my children were both born very premature, and they're twins, and they were in the hospital for a long while. And I have stupid things which I would save. Like I have a piece of tape which has one of their hairs stuck to it. And and it's a piece of medical tape, but for me, I could not even think of not having that close by to me. And so the idea of the material life, the life of acquisition, is slightly different than maybe the life of things. The things around you can be quite potent, can be deeply connected to the sense of self. But my feeling is that when it's acquisition, when it's things like brand loyalty, when it's things like allowing yourself to be treated as a mere consumer by our politicians, that's when we have to most staunchly push back, right? Or in doing things like repairing stuff. Like when I grew up, I remember that we constantly were repairing things. And because we live in a world of endlessly disposable objects, you can't even, it doesn't even allow you to develop an emotional connection to it. Because when the shitty fan you paid $20 for stops working, you don't then opine about how that fan was important to you growing up. You just throw it out, right? So it doesn't even exist as an object in our lives. It exists as something to be gotten rid of. And this is true even of the way that we engage with, especially resource extraction from the planet, right? It's the idea that if we don't extract oil, then it'll just sit there. Would you leave money lying in the ground? Or alternatively, if we don't extract it now, someone's going to come along in the future and extract it. And then the only people who get screwed are us, right? This kind of very narrow-minded, very that kind of just raw capitalism is that raw do it just for the sake of it is the problem. Um, Take, for example, how it's illustrated in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Bruno Latour talks a bit about this. So Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein creates this monster just to create him. He doesn't create him to love him. He doesn't create him to make him his child. And in fact, the monster complains to Dr. Frankenstein. He says, I should have been thy Adam, but instead you rejected me. And my nature was virtuous, but I became evil because you neglected me. And if you made me good, if you made my life easier, I could be good again. And so that's often when the idea of capitalism is your relationship only extends to a thing as far as it has utility for you, right? And that separating that relationship of mere utility, mere usefulness, mere extraction is really what is most important.
I would add something to this, the question about minimalism, and I really like how you talk about object and relationships to them and the memory they create. But I would also say that we often take something like the idea of minimalism and make that a new religion. It's like if I just clear my house of all the clutter, my mind will be free. I'll be a new person, and life will be perfect. And it's almost we make it a new religion, and then if that doesn't work well, that then we glom onto the next latest trend. And I think what you're talking about is really reflection. I really like what you talked about, the notion of leisure as a political theme, so that we can have the time to reflect, but to really to see life as a journey of relationships with each other, with the divine, with creation, and also the objects that that are part of us, that also have a life. I don't want to say have a life on their own, but they express more than just the actual object. Like that hair, it's not just a hair. I'm moved by that. That's a relationship and a memory. And so So, but again, as humans, we try to box something. This is it. This will solve all my problems. And then we're constantly disappointed rather than find steps forward.
I think it's because a lot of these things, even like minimalism, if you're not looking at it as like a monastic discipline that has a very deep and profound like thought behind it, then we're still kind of looking outward, you know? So like secular minimalism and Marie Kondo, all of this stuff is like just like removing clutter in your space and in your mind, but then what? And so I think, you know, it's like, you know, as really Adnan says, you know, you have this $20 fan and it has no relationship to you. It's just a thing, you know, but when you have things that are in a sense, some sort of inanimate relationship, it changes everything, you know?
Mm. I really struggled actually with Mary Kondo and that kind of stuff. It's just because it seemed like the cruelest trick of capitalism was to fill my house with crap and then to sell me a program that helps me throw it out so I can buy all over again. It's just like the ultimate trick, right? That empty the space so you can fill it again. That's awful. And I totally would do that. I would end up rebuying all of the knickknacks and tchotchkes and all the stupid things that we have that are needful. But I feel it also happens with race, like Robin DiAngelo's program, for example, about white fragility. On the one hand, it's a useful thought exercise to use that stuff to think through, but on the other hand, she leads kind of corporate. Fix your racism problem retreats where she comes in for $10,000 and then works with your corporation to fix your race problem. And then you can say, well, our corporation went through the Robin DiAngelo program. Like we fixed race at Bayer, you know, that we'll never have a race problem again. We sorted that out. We paid for the problem to go away. We brought an exterminator in. They exterminated the problem, and it's now gone. And to any racialized minority still in the room, and it's like, I didn't want you to feel guilty. I just didn't want you to mistreat me or call the cops on me when I'm going for a jog at night, like it happened to my brother-in-law. Um, so yeah.
Stefan, you had your hand raised for a question. You're on mute, just FYI.
Now, step one is lower hand. Step two is unmute. First of all, thank you for presenting, contextualizing, and elaborating on the poetry today. And one thing that you're consistently speaking against is definite answers. And I appreciate that the poetry sort of encourages that. It's not here is what you need to know. It's here's what you need to consider. Here is a path towards where you need to find yourself. And I appreciate that. It's got sort of a koan angle to it. And this is a new aspect of the world that I was unfamiliar with before now. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I have been, my colleague Maggie and I have actually, we tried doing experiments in these kind of methods. What would it mean to shift our relationship to something like a text? And I actually, I have a St. Mary's TEDx talk on this, in which I talk about our relationships to animals, for example. For me, I was reading this 10th century text with my colleague Maggie, and it wasn't making sense to me. And I wondered if the reason it wasn't making sense is because it's a work on animal rights. That I was eating animals while reading the book. And so I said, okay, let me stop. Let's stop eating meat. Let's try in 6 months to see if the book reads differently to me. And it did. And a year later, it read differently. And a year and a half later, it read differently. And what I had to do was, if I changed my subject relationship to the community complaining about injustice, even in historically that far distant in the past. And it was these animals, and the book is called "The Case of the Animals versus the Humans." It's animals sue human beings for being treating them poorly. in this story. And the end of the story, the conclusion is that human beings have the choice, that either they will move more towards being sages or they will move more towards being devils. And the reality is, exactly as you said, Safan, that now I had the information, now that I had the animals expressing the injustice in human language to me, it became impossible for me to continue that relationship. My heart had shifted. So now I cannot start eating meat again. It's just not possible for me. It doesn't even smell like food anymore, and it took just stopping it, and that's really what it took to shift my ethics, because you can't read animal ethics literature or animal ethics philosophy today while eating meat and have it feel like it's not coming after you. Um, and so you will just then not read it, right? And so, but if you want to read it and if you want to engage it, you have to make that ethical shift. That's hard.
Thank you. I could go on about that forever because I had a similar experience that led me towards becoming a vegan a few years ago. But I feel like that's another topic we could have one day, or something. So I recognize that it's about 10 after 3 now, and we like to respect everyone's time to just say that if you have to go now, we understand if you have other things or you're just zoomed out because it's been over an hour. And I just want to say thank you so much, Adnan. And so we'll kind of formally wrap this up. And then if anybody wants to stay on after we stop the recording and just chat for a few more minutes about anything, like that's totally cool. And just before Ellie stops the recording, I'm just gonna say that next week we have another cafe that I think is gonna be incredible. Maggie just waved. Maggie Abdulmasi is going to be our guest next week. Maggie was also a professor of mine at St. Mary's, and she has this really wonderful, insightful journey. She started out as a PhD in chemistry, but through a life experience that changed her, she ended up with a lot of questions about faith and went and did a PhD in theology and is now a professor in religious studies. And so I wanted to ask her about that journey and have a great conversation about sort of just how life takes you in unexpected places and all of these sorts of things. And so if you are interested in that, then you should join us next week with Maggie. So thank you, Adnan, again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And you can stop the recording now, I guess.